Hello, hello. Thank you for tuning in to Grieving Voices. Today, I'm excited to share my guest, Kris Carr, with you, my listeners. She is a multiple New York Times bestselling author, wellness activist, and cancer thriver. She's been called a force of nature by O Magazine and was named a new role model by the New York Times. Kris is also a member of Oprah's Super Soul 100, a group of the most influential thought leaders today. Her latest book, I'm Not a Mourning Person, Braving Loss, Grief, and the Big Messy Emotions That Happen When Life Falls Apart, shares what to expect when you're not expecting your world to fall apart. It's raw and inspiring, but has joy, humor, and hope too. This book gives readers tips and strategies to move forward and start living again. Kris has helped millions of people take charge of their health and live like they mean it through her award winning books, blog, online courses, and membership communities. Thank you so much for being here and taking your time to share with my listeners. And I just got to say, I loved the book. Highly
Hmm.
recommend. Sorry, you can't really see it. I don't know. I don't know why I blur the background, but I loved it. And I do have one question because I want to make sure I ask this because I don't remember reading the acknowledgments the first time. And so I just kind of peeked through now. What book on grief were you given by your friend Jeanette?
Oh, well, that's Julia Samuel's book.
Julia Samuel's book. Okay.
Yeah, and one of her books, and that was my introduction to a world that I was resistant to enter. And then once I entered it, I realized actually this is the conversation that not only do I need for myself, but I want to have with other people because it's the most meaningful conversation that I could have. And I think I didn't realize up until my most recent life kick just how grief was woven into the nooks and crannies of my heart, my history, and how it was really something I was so afraid to touch. And yet it was holding me back.
In reading the book, I resonated with so many aspects of your story of I like reconnected with parts of myself where like I was like I could imagine myself back in time and feeling those similar emotions. And I mean, I just have I have like a million and one questions, it feels like, on my paper. But what you're here to talk about, though, is the death of your father, which seems to have been the catalyst for you to explore grief in a way, a deeper and more meaningful way than you ever had, despite all of despite a stage 4 cancer diagnosis that you've been living with and all of that. Like, because there's a lot of grief in that. And so to
Mhm.
not really touch it until recently. Yeah, it's a very timely book, I'm thinking, for you.
Oh, definitely for me. And it wasn't the book that I set out to write. I've written 7 books. This is my 7th book. And, there comes a time when your publishers are like, so when are you gonna write another book? And it had been a minute. And there was this idea that I should write something that's more mass market, more appealing. I've written books for cancer patients. I've written books about plant-based living. Apparently, I like to tackle difficult topics, vegetables and disease. And so anyway, there was these conversations about me writing something for a wider audience. And I initially went to that, what's that self-help, aspirational, inspirational book that I could write, which at some point I will probably write. But everything in my body and in my being and in my heart was like, I can't write that book now. I don't feel that way. I'm not inspired by that conversation. I am hurting. And so this was my father was diagnosed with cancer in 2016, and he lived for about 4.5 years with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And during that time, obviously it's a big life change for the whole family. But I was approaching my milestone of living with my own stage 4 cancer for 20 years. We were in the middle of a global pandemic. So each and every one of us was hurting in a whole new way and losing people left and right, losing our jobs, losing our former sense of selves, losing our sense of safety and security. And my business was struggling because I had taken the steps to pull back so that I could be more present with my family. And what I realized is I hadn't life-proofed my business to allow me to do that. And so I was going through a very difficult time. And my initial response, even though I've been in the wellness world for 20 years, and so I've done a lot of my own personal work, and I've coached a lot of people in 20 years, even though I thought I had done this kind of deep healing work when it comes to our mental health and heart tending, it was a big blind spot for me because my go-to is to hustle, is to solve, is to fix, is to get the job done. And I was in a time and place where there wasn't a way to get the job done. Right? It was a much deeper, more spiritual, more impactful journey that I would have to go on. I couldn't check a box or get something behind me, much like living with cancer. And so instead of trying to push the river or hold back the ocean, because I was afraid it would devour me, I decided to go through it, and I remember the moment I write about in the introduction when the dam broke, when I was sitting in a parking lot at CVS and my mother had asked me to go get more Ensure because it was the only thing my dad could tolerate. And I'm at the aisle not knowing how many to get because I don't know how much time he has to live. And I'm not consciously choosing those thoughts, but here they come. And it was that moment of pushing it down and working harder and all the things that I do to avoid pain where I couldn't hold it back anymore. And I was running through the CVS to get back to my car so that nobody would see me cry. And I get in, I break down, all of the emotions coming out. And afterwards, I feel this quiet in the storm. I start to feel a little bit better. I feel a break from the fever. And I think to myself, what are the other areas of my life that I am holding back the opportunity to feel better? By just allowing myself to be with the emotion. And that truly was the turning point for me to say, oh, I have to look at this.
One of my mottos is allowing myself to feel is allowing myself to heal. That
Mm-hmm.
pretty much embodies what you just shared. I think the importance of just allowing ourselves to feel what we have to feel, even if it's to go into our car and have an ugly cry.
You're so right. And for many of us, we've never allowed ourselves to do that. Maybe we don't even know what we're feeling. We just know that there's some sort of disturbance in the force. We're feeling off, we're feeling unsettled. And perhaps that's old stuff. Like when we were kids and we didn't have the words to describe what pain we were experiencing, what discomfort we were experiencing, we may not also have those words as adults. And so it's an incredible exploration process to even say, what if I just start by trying to identify and articulate what feeling is up for me right now? I don't have to fix it. Maybe I could just give it a name and start there.
On your Instagram, I saw you had a picture of yourself as a little girl, which prompted me to read the caption. Can you share a little bit about that for our listeners?
About being a little girl.
Mm-hmm. Having the exercise of taking a picture of yourself as as a
Yeah.
child.
Sometimes when we don't know how to self-soothe, we weren't given those tools, many of us, and our parents weren't given those tools either. And certainly we find ourselves in a time of mourning. Then if we don't know what to give to ourselves, I like to have that picture, and it is the picture that I use up on my desk, or it's like in my bathroom, or it's in my closet when I'm getting dressed, and to just check in with her and ask her what she needs, and to allow her to say, what I really need is a little break. I actually need to play a little bit. I need to give myself more unstructured time, because she's still there, and but all of the way that I put on masks, or, I remember when my mantra was suck it up, buttercup. Like, what a terrible mantra, right? But it was one I followed. And if I'm willing to tend to her and say, I love you, I'm here for you, what do you need? I've got you, I can reparent you, then inevitably I, adult Kris, start to experience the healing that comes from that.
Can we talk a little bit about, because in your book you share how being a child of anxious parents, and because you mentioned it just briefly there a little bit, how that shaped you into adult life, being a child of anxious parents. Because I have this theory that, and reading your book, I'm like, okay, well, that makes sense, because I have the theory that a lot of children are carrying anxiety and fears that aren't even theirs.
Yeah.
It's that of their parents. And then I read that in your book and I'm like, okay, that's kind of affirming.
Yeah, I mean, we are these blank slates, and we pick up vibes, we pick up energy, we pick up behaviors. I think we come here and we are then domesticated. And so much of what our job is in this lifetime is to unlearn and to come back to the original source, which is that self-love, love for self, love for others, love for life. And so naturally, if we're raised by parents who are anxious, then anxiety is going to maybe even be one of our go-to responses to things. We're kind of moving through life fearful. And anxiety really is a rumination about what may or may not happen, right? It's kind of taking fear and saying, I'm thinking ahead. I got to cover my bases. I got to have my own back. The world is unsafe. How can I get ahead of this situation so I can make sure I stay safe? And fear and anxiety serve a purpose, right? I say in the book, and often try to remind myself, that we can't amputate any of our emotions and expect to be whole. So oftentimes, I think in our very black and white society, certain emotions we deem positive and emotions that we should strive to have and show, and other emotions we deem negative, as if therefore there's something deficient about us for having them. And it's sort of like saying, here are all the crayons in the crayon box, but Victoria, you can only use blue, green, and red, because all the other colors are bad. And if you use those colors, you're bad. And you might be like, but secretly, I love yellow, And so I think when we get a little curious about these emotions and what they're here to teach us and show us, which we can talk about, then we can follow the breadcrumbs and understand how they work and why our brain uses them. Why are we designed to experience anxiety from time to time? How is it a benefit to us? How does it truly keep us safe? And how does it go awry, right? What do I need to do when I'm finding myself spinning out, let's say before a CAT scan? I get checked every 5 years. There's always going to be some anxiety before I go in for my scan. This is the moment 21 years later when my doctor says, oh, it turned on, it's finally aggressive. This is what we've been waiting for. Right? I'm gonna have some anxiety, but I can develop some tools to soothe that anxiety. I can develop some tools to make sure that that anxiety doesn't become a rumination that's out of control, that can even become almost like an addiction, like a hotspot that I'll just go to. It's almost like we're going to the mental gym when we're dealing with some of this stuff.
For those that may not be familiar with you, have never heard of you, can you just briefly share? Because I know we've mentioned it, but we haven't really said about your diagnosis. And then I'd like to move into how that anxiety and that fear played a role through your diagnosis, and how that transitioned to when you became then a caregiver for your father. And then the moment that you realized, there's like three, I have a note here, there's three spiritual or three pivotal moments that led you to writing the book. And so, can we rewind and then fast forward a little bit?
Yes. So I was in a very different career and had very different hopes and thoughts and dreams for my life. And then on Valentine's Day in 2003, I was diagnosed with a rare and incurable stage 4 cancer. And so the first doctor that I met with suggested a triple organ transplant. The next doctor gave me 10 years to live. The doctor after that suggested radical treatments that wouldn't do anything. And it was that moment where I realized I had to become my own advocate, and I had to become, as I like to call it, the CEO of my health. So as a CEO, the leader of our lives, it's like, okay, I'm responsible for putting together the team, for hiring, for firing, for finding my second in command, because the doctors work for me. And I was lucky, or actually just hardworking, to find a great oncologist who knew the most about my very rare disease, who had his finger on the pulse of research, and who also had a wonderful bedside manner. So I was very surprised when he said, sometimes your disease can be slow growing, it can become aggressive. We just don't know. We have to watch and wait. And while we're doing that, we want you to watch and live.
Mm.
And I didn't really know how to do that. So the first place I went afterwards was the grocery store, because I figured vegetables were good, even though I hated them. And what I was truly looking for was some sort of control, some place to put my energy so that I could feel like I was participating in my well-being as opposed to participating in my disease. And that's what started the work that I do. First and foremost for cancer patients when I began, and then later for people who are interested in not becoming patients, because I truly believe that self-care is healthcare, and
Mm.
that we have more power than we think. And again, this career is not something that I went into saying this is what I want to do, but I think for many of us, our lives change in sometimes miraculous ways because of these warning signs or wake-up calls that we have. And this is what I chose to do with my wake-up call, because again, I live with stage 4 cancer. This is a marathon for me. Um, and I'm very, very inspired to live every moment like it is my first, and I can't wait to have another. And so, where are we going after this?
With your
Where would
father.
you like me to take you after this? We had a 3-part question.
I did. I know. I tend to do that.
Okay.
Try to squeeze it all in. Just the anxiety of that
Yeah.
diagnosis and the experience of going through that and then being hit with another rupture, as you call it in your
Yeah.
book, of your father.
So for me, like I said earlier, I am the person that's going to pretty much try to put a plan in place. And I think it's very helpful to do that. It's one of the reasons why my work has helped a lot of people, is because I help people and people who don't want to be patients just put that wellness plan together. But a lot of that came from my fear, and a lot of that came from my anxiety. So isn't that wonderful though? So fear and anxiety help me out in a big way. The problem is when they take over and they shut you down, they paralyze you, they make it so that the only thing that you feel like you can do to cope is to numb because they're just too big. And so that's when all of our self-care principles and practices, the toolkits that many of us go through life trying to build, we want to open the box and lean on a few of them, whether it's through breath work, whether it's with a therapist or a counselor, like, hey, these emotions are too big for me to hold on my own. Oftentimes there may be other things tied into them, past traumas, past griefs. One of the things that my therapist talked about and I wrote about in the book is, she says, when the grief train pulls into the station, it brings all the cars.
Mm.
The stuff you thought you were over, it was behind you, and you're just totally sideswiped. Brings up trauma, it brings up anxiety, it brings up shame, it brings up rage. For me, I went through a period where, my number one emotion I was experiencing was not grief, it was rage. I'm like, where is all this hot energy coming from? Well, it's old stuff. And so, learning to live with stage 4 cancer for me is more of a mental game than a physical game. It's about learning how to work with my fear and anxiety as opposed to be overwhelmed by it. Because those moments are going to come. I was talking to a patient the other day, and, you know, I'll go to, okay, I'm having this anxious moment. Let me get in my body. Because sometimes when I'm in an anxious, spiraling out place, I'm having kind of an out of body experience. Right. So I can jump on my bike or jump in the water. You know what I mean? Like right now I'm in Florida, the ocean's nearby. Like, well, I can just go for a quick swim. And it's going to change the channel. It's almost like we're dogs with in brain rot, licking a hot spot. Well, what if the scan's worse? And what if this? And what if that? Well, in this moment, none of that is true. I like to say it's not something till it's something. So why don't you get back to living?
Mm.
Yeah. Or it's been 21 years since I've been dealing with this. I know I'm going to feel anxious. I'm going to allow myself that day or the day before to go there. But before then, why am I wasting time? Now, is it as easy as that? No. But for me, I've been able to work with my brain.
You've had a lot of time to practice.
I've had a lot of time to practice. I'm like, come out, let's go for a bike ride. In this moment, how you feeling? Pretty good. Let's focus there.
So when it was kind of training ground for you when this happened with your father, I imagine that you had to lean on a lot of those tools that have supported you in getting through your own diagnosis and the spiraling thoughts and all of that. And did
Very much.
anything, what did you learn about that, about yourself through the process? Um, and how did that change you? Your
Well,
perspective, maybe, of a lot of things.
very beautiful question. I mean, I think I'm still learning it. And I think that it was all well and good for me to work with my own palette, which is me. But then when it came to working with, the potential of losing someone that I love very dearly, he's my chosen father, so he adopted me. And that was really hard for me because what was coming up, what I didn't realize was a lot of the old abandonment wounds, the core, father wound was highly activated at the idea of losing him. Because whether I was conscious of it or not, what I was feeling was that he was leaving me. And that's what happened the first time with my biological father. And that's when you go, oh, I have an opportunity here to work with some really old stuff because he's not leaving me, he's dying. And I want to spend as much good time with him as I can. So because of that, it was inspiring to do the work and to go back into therapy and to initially I was like, oh no, cancer's not on my watch. There's one thing I know, it's navigating cancer, and it's not taking you. I got pissed and angry and called everybody I knew, and I got some wonderful people in my address book. The problem is that he didn't want to do any of it.
Mm.
So the treatments that he was undergoing were really hard. So we could do enough to, keep him as well as possible, but he wasn't going to do a full-on lifestyle, save my ass technologies, Kris Carr plan. Right. And so I had to make peace with that and say, the best medicine that I can deploy right now is love and making sure that when I enter the room, love is leading the way. And that the time that I have with him is filled with it. And so there's a lot of gin rummy. There's a lot of really wonderful times that we had. And I learned how to let go of more control, which was very anxiety provoking for me. And just to continue to show up with love, even though my heart was breaking and breaking wide open too.
In this book, you really do speak the language of the work that I do in grief recovery. with the grief recovery method, and you talk about how grief manifests in our lives and in our bodies, and talk about keeping busy. You essentially address, like, there's 6 myths of grief, and you essentially address them all, like including STIRBs, or short-term energy relieving behaviors, and these things that we do to occupy ourselves and distract ourselves from our feelings. And you've had so many years of sitting with and working through your grief before writing this book. um, who are the people or the resources that have supported you and provided the information that gave you that new perspective? And I know you mentioned that book, on grief, but kind of even before that, earlier in your, like, when you were diagnosed and as you were going through that journey, what were the things that helped you shift your perspective, um, from woe is me, to this mission, the self-driven mission? Or was it just, did perfectionism take over? Because I know you talk a lot about perfectionism in your book too, a little bit.
I don't know, maybe sometimes. Maybe sometimes, but I think so. I practice what I call the 5 pillars of wellness. So they are basically being mindful of optimizing what you're eating, drinking, thinking, and how you're resting and renewing. And all of that sits on a foundation of stress management, because we know that stress is really the number one killer. And stress comes in all sorts of ways, including heartache. And so that's the basis of the lifestyle practice that I teach in my books and in my community. Um, and that all came from all of my research as first and foremost, as a cancer patient. What can I do to extend my life? Is there any way I can participate and help my longevity, help my odds? And it's really the basis of lifestyle medicine, which has been around for a very long time, And so all of that work for 20 years now has certainly taught me a lot about myself and my body. The big turning point for me, I think, emotionally, was on my 10-year cancer anniversary, when, one of the doctors had originally given me 10 years to live. And here I am making it to the 10-year mark. And everybody was so thrilled except for me, because I didn't think that unless it was behind me, I could really live my life. So I was very frustrated, very angry. And so I was trying to cure myself, since the doctors couldn't cure me, and it wasn't happening. But I also my disease wasn't progressing either. And so it was just something that I was having to learn to live with. And there are many things for everybody that we might not want, but we have to learn to live with. And for me, it's cancer. And so I remember thinking in that moment, when everybody's celebrating but me, that I have to come up with a better way, because I could live my whole life with this disease and I could waste it all, because I wasn't truly living unless it was behind me on paper. I got that stamp of approval. You're in remission. And what have I lived? A whole lot of years, healthy and happy, if I allowed myself to be. But I didn't get that stamp of approval. And that's when I started to think about the difference between healing and curing. And that curing may or may not happen. It happens in the physical body. It happens for some of us, doesn't happen for all of us. There are a lot of people out there who are living really big, abundant, wonderful lives with chronic illnesses, chronic shit pickles, just chronic stuff. And that's okay. But healing can happen for each and every one of us. There is no timeline. And it can happen even beyond our physical form. And so I started to move more in the direction of aspiring to be on a healing path, and to be loving and patient and caring with myself. And that, to me, when you say, okay, where'd you learn this? What are the most inspirational resources or whatnot? It was actually that mental shift that changed everything. There are incredible grief resources out there, right? You're one of those incredible resources. And it was a world I wasn't very familiar with. And then when we get interested, when we get curious, when we start to, do the research, buy the books, follow the breadcrumbs, we start to find the voices that resonate for us. But the principles are still universal, and that is that, or at least I believe they're universal, that our emotions are energy. We can't amputate them. We need to allow them to flow. When energy is stagnant, it's not good for your physical body. It's not good for your mental health. And emotions are also filled with information. So if we can become a little bit more emotionally literate and curious, then we can start to learn how to tend to these crayons, these parts of ourselves that make up the whole beautiful picture that is us.
I'd love to talk about anger a little bit because you talk about a lot about emotions, and you mentioned anger, and you mentioned anger quite a bit in your book too. And I didn't realize, I mean, it took me, I mean, I didn't address my grief until 2019. And that was at that point over 30 years. So I had a lot of time to build up a lot of anger and resentment. And so to allow those floodgates to open, it was like, if we imagine ourselves like a tea kettle, and this pressure just keeps building and building and building. And if we don't release that pressure, it like we literally are dying from the inside very, slowly, and just deteriorates our bodies. And like you said, it's stress, it's physical stress, emotional stress, mental stress. Imagine that as is your body like a tea kettle. So
Mhm.
allowing that rupture in that way, a good rupture, that's a good rupture, you know. Um, but there's a part I wrote here, and it says we act out instead of crying out because anger feels powerful while grief feels powerless. And you talk about caring for your anger, and your grandmother had um, a motto: don't cure the darkness, light a candle.
Mhm.
And I absolutely love that. But in talking about anger and the wisdom that anger has for us, what has anger taught you?
My anger is very powerful, and my anger helps me to be a fighter when I need to fight. And it has protected me. It has inspired me. There have been so many moments, even as a female entrepreneur, when somebody has told me, pipe down, ambition is not appropriate for women, be satisfied with what you're getting, even though I know other people are being paid more for the same work, where I relied on the wisdom of anger to say, no, right? And so I don't want to vilify it. And yet, I definitely need to learn more about it because it'll be a go-to emotion for me if I'm not careful, thoughtful, inquisitive. Um, my grandmother also used to say that emotions like anger and grief specifically were unbecoming
Mm.
for women. And came from a very different time, right? And so the chapter on anger is called Becoming Unbecoming. And when I started to explore it more, and I have in my own therapy for many years, but actually starting to explore the mechanics of anger, almost like, you're approaching a research project, is that many people say that it's a signaling emotion, right? And it's signaling to something else. It's like the tip of the iceberg is what you see, but underneath of the iceberg is so much bigger. And so, what is it signaling? What is it trying to point out to us? Sometimes it can be injustice. Sometimes it can be extreme pain, like anger is saying, ow, this is not okay, right? And anger is also very protective. And so for me, if grief was something that felt so scary and so destabilizing, there's a reason why we go into fight, flight, or freeze, because it's like the physical manifestation of us protecting ourselves. If an emotion like grief feels so unstabilizing to many of us, because again, we don't necessarily have the tools for this, especially because we live in a grief phobic society, right? So few of us know how to talk about these things or want to talk about these things because we're afraid of how people will react. Then an emotion like anger can easily step in and help you out. Like, oh, I'm starting to feel these emotions. I'm starting to feel out of control. I start to feel so uncomfortable. And then all of the stuff that can bubble up as a result of that, people will judge me. People won't like me. People won't want to hang out with me because I'm a big downer. Boom. I got you, Buttercup.
There was one part too where your grandma, where you talk about making yourself small. Um, I can't remember exactly how it went, but just to the what you were just saying, how we make ourselves small, especially when we're trying to express anger, and then we're told you're too much or you're too loud, or be seen and not heard, and all of these messages that we receive more commonly as little girls, right?
Yeah.
Um, do you see yourself as um, kind of this? I mean, would you describe yourself as a child and like kind of like this, not like a free spirit, kind of wild, um, kind of like a poking the bear, questioner, initiator of things, maybe initiator of other people? Would you describe yourself like that?
I think as a child, I was definitely a free spirit and a very creative little soul. And very imaginative, very caring, somebody who's I hopefully still have those traits. Very connected to animals and nature. And I don't think I was a bear poker because I think I was very shy.
Hmm.
And very kind of like, I got to figure out, feel my way because the world isn't safe. Um, it wasn't until much later in life that I became a bear poker.
Yes. Okay. That's what I was going to get to, because when you start coming into your own, right? Because you had a lot of grief in your childhood. So I saw myself in your story. And that's why I asked that, because yeah, I felt like we're kindred spirits in a way. As I was,
Yeah. Oh, well, that's wonderful. I mean, I think the more I don't know if you feel this way, but the more work that I've done to heal my heart and befriend myself and really like who I am. And I think one of the greatest things that you can ever experience in this life is the joy of your own company.
Mhm.
And I really want to park on that for a minute because people don't talk about it enough. I mean, getting to a point where you enjoy your own company is so big. We come here alone, we leave here alone, and we live in an epidemic of loneliness. We do need each other. We need community. We need support. We need our people and our true blues. But damn, we need ourselves.
I
None
think
of
it
them.
goes back to what you said about self-soothing, that
Yeah,
ability to do that.
I don't think any of that matters unless we can do that because all of it was temporary. You're always going to reach outside of yourself.
Mhm.
And then when a relationship ends, it's going to be so destabilizing because you never had that relationship connection with yourself first and foremost. And so to go back to your question, when did I start to come into my own? It was more so when I said, I don't really care what other people think about me. I don't want to be a jerk. But I'm less interested in what other people think about me and more interested in that relationship and what I think about me and my ability to enjoy my own company.
I'm glad you said that, because I actually had are you someone who enjoys alone time? Maybe
What?
even need it? Because that was actually one thing I wrote on there, because I love my alone time. I need it. I love my own company. But this is a great segue into having more four-legged friends than two-legged friends.
Mm.
And the fact that you don't have children, but you've had, Buddy, your dog. You talk about losing Buddy, your dog. And I just kind of want to talk about, if you are open to sharing, about um, the importance that animals played a role in your healing, and as you were grieving.
Yeah. They always will. They're so a big part of my life. And and I've had a lot of fur children. And you know this because you are in this world. And so I remember the first time that I got the concept that the other side of grief is love.
Mhm.
And the more that we love, the more we're going to grieve. But who wants to go through life saying, oh, no love for me, because I don't want to feel that pain. And so taking on all these incredible companion animals, you know that at some point you're going to have to say goodbye to them. And several of my fur children were very instrumental at certain points in my healing. My cat, I dedicated my second book to my cat. My cat was the first person I told I had cancer. Crystal, I've got cancer. What are we going to do? Right. And so she was a big part of that early journey. And then Buddy was a big part of making peace with not having children. And then here comes this big old hound dog who is, near death, emaciated. We found on the side of a mountain while we were hiking and nursing him back to health. And thinking, wow, there's love all around if I just choose to open to it. Might not be in the form that I think. And it's in this case, it's a big old hound dog, but boy, do I love him. And life is still good. And then most recently, my dog Lola, who is probably my number one soulmate. Um, and so she was there throughout my dad's journey, and she passed after. And I think
Mhm.
she stuck around because she knew that it would be so big for me, and I couldn't lose them both at the same time. So we have all these opportunities. And the reason why I write about pet loss in the book is because I was actually shocked by a lot of the grief books and grief literature that didn't either include it or dealt with pet loss in a way that felt very diminishing.
I actually just developed a pet loss program, but
Oh,
it hasn't launched yet. And because I've had clients that I've worked with where it was a single woman. She didn't have children. She didn't have a spouse. Her family were in another country. Like she came here with knowing nobody. And then her dog was her everything. And so people don't understand or even think about grief when it comes to pets, but it's like, we can just go out and get another pet. And the things people say, right? And it just, yeah, it's so, this is why I started this podcast, so people can learn, right? So people can learn through people's stories of the import of all the different ways we grieve. But even if you're listening to this and you, for whatever reason, can't have a pet, get a plant. Nurture a
mhm.
plant. I see a plant in your background. I have one right on my shelf here. I started, actually, that was one of the things that I think naturally came up for me. And as I was starting my healing, was I just started accumulating plants left and right. Like, it's nurturing something.
Oh,
I think get a plant
yeah.
and think of yourself as a plant. Like, what does a plant need? It needs water, it needs sunlight, it needs, I think it goes back to, what is that, Dr. Emoto with the water and the rice
Mhm.
experiment where you talk to it. And I mean, you could talk to
Mhm.
your plants, you talk to your pets, right?
Oh, yeah.
But none of those things like judge, analyze, or criticize you. So you can say whatever you want. And I think that's the different dynamic of that relationship, is that, and why the bond is so deep for so many people with their pets, is that they feel, like you said in your book, it's like Christmas morning. Every morning, every day that your dog sees you, it's like you could be gone 3 minutes. Like I can leave and be gone for 3 minutes, and my dog, it's like Christmas morning. It was perfectly how you said that. So yeah, I think it's one of the most minimized losses, and so it is something that I'm looking to address. And
I'm so happy to hear that.
so I'm
And
glad we talked about that. Um, Let me look on time. Okay, so can I just do like a quick run through of
oh,
questions, just
yeah,
like
of course.
okay. Oh, and maybe these aren't going to be quick answers. I don't know. Let's see. I loved how you said life is a terminal condition. We're all going to die, but how many of us truly live? And acceptance helps get you there. And I think you've really touched on that quite a bit. Not as much on the acceptance piece, but I guess I'll ask you this. What does acceptance mean to you?
Acceptance for me means that I accept who I am and what my needs are, and then I have my back. I'm
Mm.
not trying to be somebody I'm not. I'm not putting myself into a box that was not made for me. And that's a piece of it, but also accepting when I'm going through a difficult time that this is what's happening. I'm not sugarcoating it. I'm not trying to slap on an affirmation, even though I think affirmations are very helpful. I'm accepting that this is where I am so that I can do the healing work. That perhaps some of that healing work will help me get to another place. But if not, I'm giving myself which is exactly what I need, which is some heart tending.
And even if just for that moment you feel better, I mean,
Yeah,
that's a win.
it's a huge win.
Um, as your dad was going through his cancer treatment, I'm just curious on this because I spoke with another trained in the end of life doula, and I spoke to another gentleman just recently, and the big conversation was having your affairs in order and just preparing and all of that. And so I imagine, like, when you got your diagnosis, um, and when your father received his, was that something that had you already? Is that something that you like made a mission to take care of, like get your affairs in order? Is that something that your dad made a priority um, when you first diagnosed?
When I was first diagnosed, I didn't want to get my affairs in order. And there was a lot of frustration around my unwillingness to get my affairs in order. And it's one of the reasons why my biological father left my life again.
Mm,
So I met him when I was 18, and he split again when I was not long after I was diagnosed. And it was partly around that. And so for me, it was like, I will do this on my own timeline when I'm ready. I'm not ready to talk about this. And I'm not going to have it forced upon me. So, but obviously it's helpful to have these things in place. It's something that I'm working on now. Now I'm 52 and I really wasn't ready to do it. And for me, it was a psychological block. And now it feels like, my husband and I get on a turbulent plane and we own our business together and we run everything together. And it's sort of like, geez, feel a little stressed out that we don't have, I mean, so it's like, let's just take care of some of these things, especially because it makes, whether you realize it or not, it brings you more peace and clarity and whatnot. And it's also really important as our life does become shorter, because dying is a big job. It's a big job. And we, as a culture, we are the first to throw the big parties and get all the gear and the showers and whatnot, for when a baby comes into this planet. And it's a wonderful celebratory event. But dying is very complicated and takes a lot of energy and it leaves a lot of tentacles. And yet it's so scary for many of us that we don't have somebody to walk through it with. And that's when a lot of stuff can happen, I think, in families too. A lot of undue stress and tension and discord and even, um, you know, estrangements and whatnot. So my dad and I talked about it a lot. At first, it was hard to talk about, though, and I wasn't sure if he wanted to talk about it. And so I approached it very delicately. Is this something you'd like to talk about? And the answer was yes. And I worked on it with my therapist because I was afraid that I would fall apart and make things worse. And I said, I am willing to talk about these things. I might not always keep it together. There will be tissues. I might say the wrong thing, but I'm willing to show up. And he was grateful for it. And so we did talk about that. We did talk about his fears. We did talk about his wishes. And we talked about what he wanted at his celebration of life. There were absolute tears. When hospice came, they told us with him in the room, that this is not curative. We are making you comfortable. Here are the stages of what will happen. This is what will happen as your body starts to shut down. This family is what we're teaching you and how to support. I had never had candid conversations like that before. It was terrifying. I was grateful that we were in the middle of the pandemic because I had a mask on and I would just pull it up really high so that nobody could see that I was like, my lips were quivering and I was crying under the mask and whatnot, because I was so scared to have that conversation. And I know people who, whose loved ones have said, I'd really like to talk about what I want you to have. And they shut the loved one down and say, I don't want to talk about this. This isn't positive. Oh, don't worry about it. You got plenty of time, la, la, la. That's all coming from that person's own discomfort, which I honor. But for the person who's dying or struggling with mortality that, may have less time than you, it can be very isolating,
Mm.
create a lot more loneliness and a lot more discomfort. So it's these opportunities that we have to really like grow up and show up.
Grow up and show up. Suck it up, buttercup. Just kidding.
I mean,
No, but
you don't want to, like,
yeah.
I really didn't want to put on my like big grown-up panties, but I was like, you're not gonna do it now. When are you gonna do it?
But it is, it's the ability to, okay, these are my emotions. I'm just going to park them to the side before I walk in this door so that I can be fully present and give my loved one what they need and so
Yeah.
that they feel heard. And that is very difficult to do. And I think when you save those conversations for the deathbed, that
Ooh,
time could be spent having rich, meaningful conversations. And so I think it's the importance of us planning for ourselves ahead of time so that we can have those deeper conversations and we're not worried about the logistics after we're gone.
yeah.
I think that's the biggest service we can give our loved ones that we
Mhm.
have power to do, I think. Yeah.
The second intention, so I want to just, I'll remind you and everyone listening, the first intention that was helpful for me, I throw it out. If it's going to be helpful for anyone else, is to lead with love.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to show up. Is it, what would love do? What would love say? What does leading with love look like? And then just do that. And then the second thing is an intention that I set for myself. And this really helped me in the difficult conversations that I thought I would literally implode or come undone or just like evaporate in my chair because they were so scary and big and hard in my mind, was how do I minimize my regrets?
Mm.
What's it going to take for me to minimize my regrets? Am I going to regret that I didn't have the courage to have this conversation when my loved one wanted to have it? Yes, I am going to regret that. Is that fear of that regret bigger than my lack of courage right now? Yes. There's your answer.
Yep. Deeper questions. The answers are in the deeper questions, really.
Not easy.
You talk about caregiving and giving versus receiving. And I loved how you said this, but being a giver, you felt like nothing could ever be taken away from me. Um, and you said, listen to the whispers before they become roars. And so just the act of like caregiving versus giving. And, I think just in reading your story, reading the book, which I highly recommend everybody does, because there's so many layers to your book that I would love to cover all of those on this podcast. But um, can you just speak to a little bit for those who are in the caregiving role and people who have always been the giver, 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 and then they find themselves in the giving role, and then like yourself, where you're diagnosed and then you're having to receive, and the challenge of that, and then you're needing, like, not needing support, but being faced with this grief of a different kind of grief, right, with your chosen father. Again, here I'm asking like three questions in one. um, can you just speak to that giving versus receiving a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's helpful for each of us if we struggle with receiving to really get to the nugget of the why. Because the nugget of the why has freedom for us. And for me, it was actually really as a result of writing this book, because when you write, you have to figure shit out.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to articulate it. You have to be able to understand it. It's not just an esoteric feeling or vibe that you have. And for me, I was like, wow, it wasn't until I wrote that sentence that pieces of me came together. you know, and I knew that somewhere, but I didn't really understand it. And it goes back to that core trauma of loss, of abandonment. So if I'm the giver, nothing can be taken from me. If I receive, something can be taken from me. So what does that hit? Big core wound for me. So if not everybody struggles with this, but if you do, like get to the heart of the Tootsie Roll Pop. And you'd be surprised what's there and go, oh, I can spend some time with this. And then it becomes easier to receive because we need to receive when we're going through these difficult times. We need self-care practices. We need to keep our well, not full, because that's not possible, but not running on empty, that you're going into burnout and then, adrenal issues and physical illness and all the stuff that comes with it. So I'm not looking for perfection here of the full tank and I'm all spiffy and I've just had a lifestyle makeover and I'm living my best life. It's like not going to happen when we're going through a difficult time. But boy, do those difficult times make us grow and evolve and become people we really want to be. So I think just to button up self-care, understanding why we might have resistance around receiving, and then as caregivers, making sure that we're putting our masks on and we're taking care of ourselves so that we can be as resilient as possible, as stress hardy as possible, because it's a roller coaster. And I always encourage people to come to the day with as much as they possibly can. And we can't do that when we're on empty.
Let me see. You talk about having two intentions for the book, like for the audience, those reading it, and for you, to normalize conversations around the different emotions so that people feel less alone and crazy, and that to heal the deeper parts of yourself as a result of this writing. And you kind of touched on one of those. But what did you learn about and heal for yourself while you were writing it and since the book has been out?
You write the book and then you think it's one thing, and then you talk about the book and it becomes something else. And so the whole process is very illuminating. And I'd say my biggest growth edge has been my willingness to talk about really difficult things, even more difficult things than my own diagnosis. And you read that vulnerability is a strength, and it can be a meme and a TED talk and all the things. But then I think for me, until I really allowed myself to go to a more vulnerable place, and I did push myself in the book to tell the stories the way they were and not a polished version that would be more appropriate for Instagram, that I did find a real strength in that. And in the strength in that vulnerability is in a hard strength. It's a soft strength. That strength and that softness of vulnerability. Something I'm still exploring and experiencing, but really enjoying.
Do you have any regrets?
My dad wanted to have a celebration of life on Zoom while he was still alive, in addition to the celebration of life that he had and we had when he was gone. And I couldn't do it.
Mm.
And I said, I can't do that. I can't do that. No. And it didn't happen. And I regret that.
Is there anything else you would like to share, or do you have a little bit of time where I can ask a few more questions?
Yeah, I can definitely do a little more time. Yeah.
Okay.
Another 5 minutes or so.
Okay. Let me just look here. I want to make sure I'm picking the one I wanted to pick. Um, oh, yeah, this is one thing you hear a lot, like especially after people pass away. They lost their battle to cancer, um, or they're losing the battle. Um, did you have moments that you felt this, or was this outside messaging? And what do you think about this messaging?
I think every patient is different. It is not my preferred messaging for myself because I live with cancer. So I don't see that I'm warring with my body. I think that I've cancer in my liver and both of my lungs. Those organs need more support. Those organs are struggling. Why am I going to beat them up? Why, you know what I mean? I want to learn more about them so I can care for them and see what they like and what they don't like. And again, going back to that part of like amputating parts of ourselves. I was warring with my body way before cancer
Mm-hmm.
of, you know, other things I didn't like about myself or my weight or whatever it was at the time. Just always in a fight with my body. And it's like, gosh, this body does so much on a daily basis to keep me alive. Things I could never even wrap my mind around. It's a miracle. It's like I want to be on the side of my body, not fighting against it. So that again does not work for me. I think my biggest pet peeve is when people who don't have cancer use cancer metaphors. Like I don't get triggered by a lot of things. I'm not a, I don't really walk on eggshells or things like this, but it does bother me when people use cancer metaphors of like that behavior is a cancer or that person is a
Mm-hmm.
metastasis or you know a lot of folks use that and so I would say don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't feel good for people who actually have cancer.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. Um, what is something about you that many people don't know? It's not in the books. You haven't said it before. I guess you answered maybe the one regret. Maybe I don't know if you've said that before,
I
but
don't know, I've never said that before. um People don't know about me. I have said a lot of things about me because I do use my stories as part of my teaching method. I like to teach through stories. Well, I have been in two Budweiser Super Bowl commercials. So
what?
in my previous career as an actor and as somebody who did a lot of TV commercials and a lot of advertising, I was in two Budweiser Super Bowl commercials.
That's pretty cool. That's cool. Too bad it couldn't have been well, the Budweiser, well, it was I thought the best one this past Super Bowl was the Dunkings. Dunkings.
That's amazing. Yeah, yeah. I usually watch the commercials because it was just like a very big part of my career, but I didn't watch them this year. But this really is kind of like the Oscars of advertising.
Yeah.
So it's very fun.
That's very cool. Okay. Well, I will leave it there. I think that's a fun, we'll leave it on a fun note. And because if I ask another question, it's going to be a deep run probably. So you just have to read the book, my friends, because all the questions I'd probably ask are in the book. Um, anything else you would like to share though?
No, thank you so much. This is a beautiful interview, and I'm so appreciative of the places that you took it. I really love having these transparent, honest conversations. Again, going back to how have you grown? What have you learned? And these are the conversations I want to have. So thank you for allowing me to have one with you and with your community.
Thank you. I purposefully did not watch any of your other podcast interviews or listen to anything else because I just wanted to stay in my own lane because I
Yay!
mean, I can't, let's see. Like I have so much. Did you see the highlight? Oh my gosh. I don't know
Oh,
why I do that screen like that, but there's so many I have highlights and doggy ears and it just really I really enjoyed the book. If people are uncomfortable with grief, I think it's a wonderful story. You again, like you said, you I think teaching through story is the best way to share information. It's something I think I personally need to do more of. And so thank you for writing this book. I think it's wonderful for people who are going through something that can maybe see a different perspective through a lens of someone who's been living it for so long in so many different ways. And so
mm,
I think it's a great example of grief and the many faces of it. So thank you.
Thanks, Victoria.
And my audience, remember, when you unleash your heart, you unleash your life. Much love. Oh, wait. I'm going to have to cut that out. Where can people find you?
You can find me at kriscarr.com. You can find me on Instagram at crazysexykris, and the book is available anywhere books are sold.
And I will put links in the show notes. Now, remember, when you unleash your heart, you unleash your life. Much love.